Bridge family. Welcome to our last of, for a while at least, Bridge Theology podcast. I am John Schleep, and I'm the pastor of Groups and Connections, and I'm here
with Pastor Nate Coleman, pastor of Outreach and Discipleship here at the Bridge.
So we have been doing this theology podcast. You have been submitting your questions to go along with our My Foundations series, and we've been tackling them and trying to address maybe some deeper things in each of our topics. And so, like I alluded to, this is our last for this series. Hopefully, we're going to get to continue to do some of these periodically moving forward. But Sunday, Nate, you taught on Eschatology, which is the big $1 million word for this week, end times.
Yes, that was kind of the last in this series. I think a very just maybe fitting place to wrap up this series, especially with everything we've talked about throughout the series about, you know, kind of having those issues where it's like something is primary, we all believe, and that's where we really focused in on Sunday. So really just wanted to keep the focus on Jesus is coming back. Woohoo! And that should make us excited, right? I think there's certain parts of our Christian faith that, you know, the cross, the resurrection, we look at those moments, and don't get me wrong, I'm not putting those moments at all down because they're incredible, but we don't look forward to the second coming with that same hope, that same anticipation, and that should be one of the greatest hopes for Christians because throughout the scriptures, throughout the New Testament, Paul is encouraging believers who are suffering with the fact that Jesus is going to come back again. All will be made right. All will be made new. And so really wanted to keep that focused, even in the end times discussion that so often gets bogged down with all of the other stuff, which we'll talk about today, and we talk some about on Sunday with the millenniums, and we'll talk a little bit more about those today. But even just talking about it here, I want people to be excited about the second coming of Jesus, and for that to bring them hope that no matter what they're walking through, King Jesus is still on the throne, and his plan has never been thwarted all along the way.
Yeah, I mean, the cross and the empty tomb, which we're going to get to celebrate this coming week with Easter. I mean, the hope for that is that I get to be made right and live with God forever. But the end times is the culmination of that, right? Like any suffering we have now, like you said, the epistles, the writers were saying, hey, don't lose heart because there's coming a time, don't worry, there's coming a time when everything will be made right again. And that should just be a huge comfort to us.
Absolutely. But with that, we know, and we tried to mention a little bit on Sunday, eschatology comes with a ton of questions and a ton of confusion, right? And so we wanted to try to tackle some of those as well today, maybe go a little deeper than we were able to on Sunday. So I think one of the first questions that is maybe just one that I think people ask every time something new or hard comes up in the world is really the question, should we be looking for signs of the end time? Or maybe how do we look for signs? Or should we be on the lookout for the Antichrist? And how do you know when he's come into the world? Just questions around, even this past year when COVID happened, I saw people asking these questions. Is this a sign of the end time?
Is this the start of the end right now?
What should be kind of maybe our posture towards that type of question or towards maybe looking for those signs of the end time?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I turn to in a question like this is actually in 1 Thessalonians 5. It says, now concerning the times and the seasons, brothers, you have no need to have anything written to you, for you yourselves are fully aware that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. I think even Jesus, you know, he famously said, no one knows except for the Father at the time. And so I think the first thing I always try to encourage people is, hey, I think there can be some good fruit that comes with an awareness of what's happening in the world, an eye to the second coming. But I mean, if the writers are saying it's going to come like a thief in the night, and Jesus himself is saying no one but the Father knows that time, I think there would be a little bit of a pastoral caution to say, hey, look to the end times. Have an eye to Jesus coming back, but don't spend all of your effort in trying to center your life on Jesus to try and figure out the time and whether or not we're in it and what that means for right now. I think like you said, if we're going to keep the main thing right now is the world is broken and a vast majority of the world is lost and separated from a good God, and Jesus is returning, and we actually want to live in a way that draws people to be made right with God, and that's what we should be concerned about. Yes, it can be exciting, and sometimes I think a little bit like, ooh, maybe I can break the code and figure it out. Man, if Jesus himself says there's no code to break out, and the epistles are saying, hey, you're not going to know, pastorally, I think we just have to say, hey, great to ponder on, but not something we should get caught up in.
Yeah. And really, the teaching throughout Scripture is that exact point.
Yeah.
It is, don't be looking for the day, be prepared for the event of it. Be prepared for the coming of Jesus. And so that's what we want to stay focused on.
I think the next thing too, Nate, would be really helpful is to kind of talk about, the majority of our end times theology comes from Revelation. And Revelation in and of itself is a complicated book.
Yes.
And some of it is based on how you read Revelation will determine what conclusions you draw about the end times. And so I thought it'd be good to kind of recap or go over maybe how we kind of can read Revelation. And really there's kind of like three primary views. One is what's called the Preterist view. And so that is reading Revelation as though, except for a couple chapters, it's talking about things that have passed. And so everything, all the imagery that John is portraying in his dream, if you read it in a Preterist view, it's all describing things of the past. The fall of Jerusalem and the temple. It's all these things that are veiled, but really relating to things of the past. And really just a couple chapters is what's coming in the future. The second one is just kind of that symbolic way of reading Revelation. This is like, hey, this is for all times. Hey, we need to read it and understand it for what's going on right now and what will come. And so every stage of the church can actually read it in this symbolic view of this is what God's going to do. And then the last one is that dispensational view. It's really that, hey, this is all future looking. Nothing it talks about has actually already happened. And so we really need to have that future view of everything written there is something we need to keep an eye for.
Yeah, and you actually did a pretty good job right there of just laying out pretty simply, this is where we start to get into the weeds, right?
Yeah.
These are the questions that we would say, hey, good Christians can actually disagree on. If you go across seminaries, across the United States, like good evangelical seminaries, you will see Christians disagree on this. Now, maybe more of them fall in one camp than another, but you will see that even throughout history of the church as well. So, right, the Preterists, they view like all the parts of Revelation, you might be familiar with, hey, there's 7 bowls and there's 7 seals and 7 trumpets and all these different like punishments, pieces of God's wrath. They view those as being kind of the same event happening and described in different terms. Recapitulation is what it's called. The book is just describing the same thing that happened back around the fall of the temple, the fall of Jerusalem back around 70 AD. So it was really written for the people who were reading it in that moment with an eye towards the future at the end of the book, that Jesus is going to come back in some way.
Which, can we just say, like, that's where then that would totally change how you read Revelation.
Everything.
Because if it's describing a thing in the past, then even the first question we ask, like, should I be looking for? Like, everyone tries to go, what's the 7? And it's like, well, if that's actually something from the past, there's nothing left for me to be trying to discern of, is that happening right now? And so how we read Revelation is going to have a huge impact on the conclusions we make about what it says.
Absolutely. And the second view, that kind of idealist type view, everything is symbolic, and it's really the idea that the book is written to people of every generation of believers. Every generation endures suffering and tribulation. Every Christian has undergone that. And so this is a book that's supposed to speak to that in some sort of way through this kind of apocalyptic, symbolic language, really pointing out the hope that we're supposed to have in the Lamb who conquered, right? That's what Revelation is all about. And so no matter what view you're taking, hey, the book's all about that. And so this maybe just hones in on that. And the last view, which we talked about just maybe a little bit on Sundays, we talked about the millenniums, is that dispensational. That's a big word, right? It's kind of a system of how you see the end times, but that's the one that maybe most people are familiar with, right? It's maybe the left behind type idea, which has some bad to it, but it has a good start in a lot of ways. But it is kind of looking at Revelation as kind of this progression of events that are going to happen in the future, this great tribulation, this millennium reign of Jesus, and then the new heaven and the new earth, right? And so that's kind of different ways people read the book, but you can see pretty clearly those different ways impact how you see everything else when it comes to eschatology.
Which is maybe a good transition. So this was one of the things I know you touched on Sunday, but let's talk kind of millennial views. Maybe go back over, hey, what are the millennial views, and how would that impact maybe how we look at the end times?
Yeah, these are some things we tried to spend a little bit more time on Sunday, because I think maybe this is some of the stuff people are most familiar with, but it does go back to how you read that book of Revelation. So the kind of first millennial view here is the post-millennial view. And that is that we're actually kind of living in the millennium right now. There's a section in Revelation where it talks about the millennium reign of Christ. And this group kind of sees, hey, maybe millennium isn't 1,000 years. It's just this time of the church age.
Yeah.
It's this church age. And towards the end of the church age, they actually see that the church is going to be successful in its mission. That rather than enduring this great tribulation at the end that everybody's kind of afraid of, they say, hey, the gospel is actually going to go forth to all these places, and God's then going to come back, and we're going to be a part of his kingdom, right? And so that goes with kind of that preterist reading of Revelation. You can see how these things pair off together. A similar one, but slightly different, is that millennial view. And that's that really there is no kind of millennial reign of the saints in that sense. Jesus is just going to come back, right? It's a little bit similar to the postmillennial view, but not as optimistic. The optimistic side of the postmillennial view says, hey, there's going to be this awesome piece of history where the church starts to reign over everything. The amillennials would say, that's probably not going to happen. We're probably going to keep suffering, but Jesus is going to come back, and then that's going to be awesome from that point forward. And that would go well with the preterist or the idealist way of reading Revelation. But then the last view, and this is what I gave a nod to, hey, if I was picking, this is the one that I would stick with, though we know faithful Christians can disagree, is the premillennial view. And that is that, hey, we are living pre the millennium, right? The millennium is still this future event where Jesus is going to come down and he's going to reign over the earth for 1,000 years with the church. This literal 1,000-year reign, a beautiful picture, and it's really kind of taking the words of Revelation 20 literally. Jesus is going to come back and reign with the church, and it really gives us kind of a purpose in a part of Jesus' reign. I love that picture of us reigning with Jesus, but that kind of ties back to that dispensational reading of Revelation. And again, you might be familiar with that with stuff like Left Behind. We're not saying Left Behind is the Bible. That's the type of thing we want to make clear. That takes all sorts of liberties and does things that we wouldn't agree with. Our starting point, though, might be the same in that type of system.
And I think this is that moment to just say, right, like this is where, while this matters, it shouldn't be the thing that divides us, right? Like, so you'll hear often, especially in seminaries, well, what view do you hold? And it's this comparison thing, but I don't think it was ever intended to be this dividing line. However, I mean, like we've said all along in this series, all of these can be dividing lines if we raise them to a point where if you disagree with me on this, we're no longer able to fellowship together. And this just isn't one of those things that we should do that in. Whether he literally comes and reigns for 1,000 years, or he comes and just redeems things, or the church is successful and Jesus reigns through the success of his church, it still is all pointing towards that big idea that you were saying on Sunday of, man, Jesus wins, right? Like God actually is successful in doing everything he promised and will bring all things to this glorious conclusion, which is great. The last, not last thing, but one of the things that maybe ties to that millennial, and this is the other one that believers tend to argue over, is the tribulation, right? Will we be here to experience the tribulation? Will God take away his people before judgment? Will we experience judgment? Nate, as you read Scripture, what are you seeing?
That's the big question. The big word you're looking for there is it's rapture, right? This is the term, hey, I'm going to be sitting here and then somebody's going to be gone and the rapture happened, right? And so you can make a little fun with the idea, but it comes from Scripture. It has a basis there. So there's kind of two views there. One is, hey, Jesus is going to come before the tribulation. So tribulation is before the millennium. So keeping things kind of in order. There's a tribulation and then the millennium. So before the tribulation, Jesus is going to come back and he's going to grab the church at that point. And he's going to stop the church from experiencing this great suffering, this great tribulation. There will still be people who end up believing in Jesus during that time. They'll have to endure the suffering, but the church will be raptured and they will come back with Jesus at the end of that tribulation to start that millennium reign. So that's one view that comes from primarily like 1 Thessalonians 4, where it does this picture of Jesus coming down and gathering with the saints, right, in the clouds. So that's where that idea comes from. The other idea, though, is to say, hey, Jesus did promise us that we would suffer, and maybe there's some discrepancy if it's during the tribulation, but in that view, the church sticks through the tribulation, and Jesus simply comes down post-tribulation after that, and then starts to reign with the saints. And people get that from maybe like Matthew 24 and 1 Thessalonians, they kind of pair these things. They say, hey, in 1 Thessalonians, when Jesus comes to get the church, it's actually more like a welcoming party. And Jesus actually goes back to the earth with the church rather than the church joins him up in heaven. So nuances in those things. If I was to give a nod, hey, I think that pre-trib makes the most sense there. But again, one of those things people get divided
I think there's
over.
a nod in there too that there's grace in both views,
Yeah.
right? Like the grace of God in us as a church being part of the tribulation is that we get to actually point to God's redeeming work in the midst of the world's suffering. The other is the grace for the church. If it's like, hey, I'm actually removing you before all of that goes on, both would be a gracious act on behalf of God. And so while we may lean more towards the one than the other, again, it's that call to say, hey, we're supposed to be united in this. Yeah. And so maybe that's just a good thing, Nate, as we wrap up this episode, but really wrap up this season of the podcast. Yeah. I mean, the whole heart of this has been, yes, to go deeper. Yes, to try and encourage our church to think deeply. But really, it was also this call to say, hey, let's know what we believe, because what we believe directly impacts what we do, but also to model how we can dialogue these things without being at odds or broken in our fellowship.
I mean, and I hope even our little conversations as a part of this have served as somewhat of a model to say, hey, what things are we clinging tightly to? How can we humbly approach theology while still holding fast to the truth, while still absolutely wanting to do that? How can we have a humble posture, though, when discussing things with other believers? I think we've had an awesome opportunity to see that throughout this series between, hey, going back to the theological taxonomy, those primary things, those secondary things. We've hit on some huge primary things, like go back to salvation, right? We talked about that and what God has done for us. But we've also talked about things like we've talked about today that are really, hey, kind of tertiary issues, we would say. Hey, they're things that even people who are in the same fellowship, the same church, can kind of disagree over these things, right? Yeah. We want to make sure we have at least that open-handedness to say some of these things faithful Christians can disagree on. It's been a great journey to see it, and I think, like you said, more than anything, what we've hoped is this hasn't just been information for people, it's been a foundation. That's why we called the series My Foundation, because we want people to have a foundation set on the truth of what Jesus has done, and to then be humbly living out that foundation in the rest of their life, sharing the love of God, sharing the gospel with their neighbors, knowing who God is, because they've actually had a chance to hear it in this series.
Yeah. Amen. So Bridge family, we'll just take this as the moment to say thank you for tuning in and listening, for engaging this, for offering questions. Like we alluded to, this will not be a weekly podcast, at least for this next season. We might have opportunities where we get to jump on and add some episodes and some things like that, but that's where you come in. If this has been a blessing to you, if God has used this in some way, we would love to hear that feedback. That same email, podcast@thebridgebiblechurch.com, that you submitted questions to. If you want to give feedback on how this has maybe encouraged your faith or been helpful, that just helps us as we continue to seek to minister to you. And so, and then the last invitation would be, we are in our Easter week. And so this Friday, we are streaming to each of your homes an online Good Friday service at 6 o'clock. It will be available. You can watch it anytime after that. But it would be that invitation to come and reflect on Jesus' sacrifice before we get to the celebration, which is Easter Sunday. We're going to be having one outdoor service at 10 a.m. on Easter Sunday, and we would just love for you to come. But we'd also love for you. In the last 2 weeks, we've been talking about end times and where people will ultimately end up. Will be that they be separated from God or in fellowship with Him. This is an opportunity to invite people to come and hear the good news. And so invite your neighbor, invite your friends. We'd love to have you join us. One outdoor service, 10 a.m. on Sunday. So we love you, Bridge family, and we will see you on Sunday for Easter.